Welcome to Grounded, Not Divided, a podcast about leaders who are getting important things done in the real world. I'm Matt Burgess. My guests on this show all have hard-won real-world experiences that shed light rather than heat on society's most vital issues. Today's episode is the first in a two-part series on K-12 education. Many K-12 education outcomes in this country are heading in the wrong direction, and K-12 education is becoming an increasingly fraught and polarizing issue. Yet, most people agree on the core objectives of K-12 education. We all want our kids to learn to read and to learn to do math at school, even if we might disagree about what books our kids should read. So, which places are doing these things well? And what can we learn from them? That's what these next two episodes will focus on. In the next episode, we will take a look at the successes of mathematics education in Quebec. But first, we'll take a look at an amazing success story in reading education in the southeastern United States called the Southern Surge. Over the past decade or so, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama have gone from having some of the worst K-12 reading outcomes in the country to having some of the best. How they did this was not about being rich or blindly spending more money. These are some of the poorest states with some of the most disadvantaged students in the country. Instead, it's a story about strong leadership, evidence-based policy and curricular reform, teacher support, and perhaps most of all, an unwillingness to accept an unacceptable status quo. To guide us through the Southern Surge story, we are very lucky to have Karen Vaites joining us. Karen Vaites is an education entrepreneur, children's advocate, and author of the School Yourself newsletter on Substack, which I subscribe to and I highly recommend. She was an executive of several K-12 education startups before shifting her career towards advocacy work, where she focuses on writing about and promoting evidence-based teaching practices. Karen Vaites, welcome to Grounded Not Divided.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to talk to somebody who works in K-12, who can help us move the conversation past what I think are defeatist narratives on both sides of the political spectrum. So on the left, I often hear things that sound like, you can't fix education outcomes in low-performing schools unless you radically transform society in a utopian way that erases centuries of injustice. And any kind of accountability for students or teachers is somehow oppressive or insensitive to the weight of the historical wrongs. And then on the right, not as pervasively, I would say, but noticeably pervasively, I feel like I hear narratives that sound like, some kids are just not smart and we need to accept that. And I find both of these frustrating because there are many bright spots, which I want to talk to you about, which you've written really interesting stuff about. But before we come back to that, let's talk about you. Tell me about your career. How did you get into education, entrepreneurship, and advocacy and writing?
Well, first, thank you for having me. And I'm the least interesting thing we'll talk about today, so I'll keep my intro to me very short. I fell into K-12 education as a bit of a happy accident. Some years ago, I'd been working in online travel of all fields and doing startups, building businesses. And I just had this aha moment that what I needed to be fulfilled was I needed to see that whatever work I did every day created good in the world in some way. And education was a bit of the family business. I was raised by a career educator who's now retired, but spent my lifetime having a mom who was running a school or eventually running curriculum or professional development for a school district. So it almost felt like coming home for me to end up in K-12. And I have worked a range of roles I've been a 3-time chief marketing officer. I've worked with leaders who were bringing the Common Core standards into practice. I've worked with leaders within the science of reading community. At this point, an almost balanced mix of working with some for-profits, mostly not-for-profits. But for the last 5 years, I've been pretty honestly frustrated in many ways by some of the things that you touch on. This sense that, to put my words on it, there's all this potential and increasingly proven potential to make certain forms of investment in teachers, their preparation to teach reading properly, curriculum that will support them in teaching reading most effectively. We have this playbook, and yet, even though we have increasing data piling up to show that the playbook is working, we seem to be having these national conversations that almost ignore the fact that the playbook exists. So I am delighted to spend time with you on this. How did I get into writing? I think I've always been a bit of a writer, but there's a running joke about my own Substack or blog that I only write when I'm really annoyed that someone hasn't written it already, which is true. I would so much rather open the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the 74 or any publication and see that someone had done this topic justice. In fact, I wrote about the Southern Surge because I started feeling a little bit annoyed that I wasn't seeing the media coverage that I wanted. And the stories I was seeing were so shallow that no one could have followed work I knew to have been robust and substantive. I was seeing the one-line version of why we had these success stories. Oh, Louisiana went back to basics with phonics, and then their reading outcomes rose substantively. And I thought, well, that's one layer of the story, but that's not the whole story. If some other state said, let's just go back to basics with phonics, they wouldn't turn into the next Louisiana. So when we have these good models, we have to talk about these good models and all of their nuance.
So before we get into the good news, I want to talk a little bit about the bad news. I think many observers, particularly international ones, would say that the US K-12 system as a whole isn't doing well. Tell me about that.
I don't know that it's easy to argue that the US K-12 system is doing well. I think everyone in the country knows that we have not had a swift rebound from the pandemic.
Yeah, I was saying it isn't doing well.
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. I think everyone probably listening knows that we have not had a swift rebound from the pandemic era. And rather disappointingly, if you look at many of our state and definitely our national exams, the NAEP, we see that we actually saw lower performance in the aggregate in 2024 than we did in 2022. So any sense that anyone had that, oh, we were going to have a short dip because of the pandemic era and all the school closures, but then kids will start to come back. Kids are resilient, we kept hearing during the pandemic. Well, it turns out that kids and schools are not particularly resilient. And right now we're struggling with a series of pandemic impacts that include the learning loss and the fact that you can't just catch up and make up months and for some kids, what went on more than a year of weaker learning via remote learning. We also see that chronic absenteeism is dramatically higher. And chronic absenteeism is what we talk about when a student misses 10 or more days of school per year. So when that starts in percentage terms to be a meaningful portion of a student's learning opportunities, and that chronic absenteeism has absolutely spiked across the country, particularly in less privileged areas. So something changed about our norms and expectations about kids even showing up to school on a consistent basis. We have higher teacher turnover. We have all forms of, we have more student behavior problems being reported across the country by teachers. So schools are grappling with a lot, but unfortunately, this isn't just a pandemic chapter that eventually we're going to get past. If we actually look at the data, the downturn in our national reading and math outcomes actually started around 2013. So the real question that people are asking is, why have we seen this, by our own national metrics, this downturn? And also on an international basis, if we look at countries like England that have started marching up in the ranks for reading proficiency, for example, what are they doing in England that we're not doing here? Not to skip ahead, but it has a lot to do with what they're doing in the 4 states we're going to talk about today.
Okay, so let's talk about that. A casual observer, if you just look at how much time in the last decade politicians of each party have spent talking about education, you might think that it's the Democrats, the liberals that care about education. And yet the places that seem to be doing the best in education, and there's actually some other areas other than education where there's the same kind of paradox that maybe we'll get to in a bit. But it's red states that are shining in the last 10 to 20 years. So you've written in particular about Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, rising from being in the bottom half to being in the top half in the last 10 to 20 years of education outcomes. That's the so-called Southern Surge. Mississippi, which I believe is the poorest state in the union, is particularly impressive. That's the so-called Mississippi Miracle. By some measures, they're number one now, I believe. So what happened?
So this isn't a simple story, but I'll try to tell it in the shortest possible version, and we'll go from there. Effectively, and I'll focus on 4 states right now: Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Alabama, because they're the states that, in the aggregate, have the strongest performance in the post-pandemic era. You alluded to Florida. Florida actually had a really good run where its reading outcomes were going up through reforms that aren't all that different from the ones we'll talk about in the 4 Southern Surge states. But Florida's growth has tailed off a little bit. So Florida was an up-and-comer, but kind of started to flatline. And so while Florida, if we look in 15-year terms, we might lump Florida into the story, but in last 5-year terms, Florida might be going amiss. And we should actually come back to reflecting on why that might be a little later. But to talk about the 4 Southern Surge states, you have 2 catalysts here. And so these 4 states have done very similar reforms in focusing on kids' foundational reading skills and better curriculum that is designed to really nurture their reading comprehension in sort of the most organic ways, if you will. And these states pursued different reforms, but they pursued them in slightly different order. So in Mississippi, they started with a more legislatively driven approach where they mandated that students, that any of their lowest performing schools had to have reading coaches in and had to train teachers in a very intensive 150-hour training. The coaches that they sent in were state coaches that were really well trained on how kids learn to read. And they passed a 4th grade retention law saying that if a student isn't reading by the end of 3rd grade, that student's going to be retained in 3rd grade, won't pass to 4th grade. So by that sort of legislation, one thing that we've seen in states that have passed similar legislation is it really just motivates all the adults to pull out all the stops because no one wants to retain a student. That's a really hard call to make no matter how you slice it. But what we see is that it really makes all of the adults, both the school, adults at the school, adults in the home, everyone around that child tends to come together to really make sure that reading success is achieved. So Mississippi pursues these sets of reforms about, close to 15 years ago. They really get started. And really interesting organic things started to happen. They were only requiring the intensive teacher training in their lowest performing cohort of schools. But suddenly, they also introduced these reading screeners so that you could see whether or not kids' early reading skills in decoding new words were developing through the school year. And suddenly, schools that were traditionally the not very good schools were performing so well in those reading screeners that teachers across the state started to notice. And suddenly you had teachers in more traditionally successful schools asking if they could take this training too. So the training started to go viral because people started realizing that something special was happening in schools where they were really investing in reading. And you were seeing these, less good, in quotes, districts starting to rise in reading outcomes. So a couple years into that work, Mississippi started saying, okay, we've got reading foundations going well, but as we start to get into the upper grades, we're not necessarily seeing some of these better practices developing in our middle and upper grades. Just because we train teachers, they're not necessarily picking the very best curriculum. So we really need to get in there and make sure that what's happening in the classroom, the curriculum is stronger end to end. So Mississippi started mandating use of curriculum from a short list of providers and in general started raising the bar for curriculum in the state. Not even necessarily to the very best curricula in the country. I I think most people would say that the curricula they recommended was a little bit of a mixed bag, but it was still on average better than what had been used. And the list included some of the very best curricula in the country. So by 2019, Mississippi starts to have better curricula entering its schools. And steadily, Mississippi has risen from being 49th in the nation in 2003 in reading outcomes to now Mississippi, sort of depending on the measure that you use, if you just look at their raw reading outcomes, they've gone from 49th to 14th. But if you look at demographically adjusted measures, which are a popular way to look at reading outcomes, because we know that many kids from more privileged backgrounds come in with deeper vocabularies, more of the raw material that we know is shown to make you more likely to succeed as a reader. So in states like Massachusetts, they are actually talking right now about how their demographics are kind of propping up their reading outcomes because they have such an overall affluent and educated population. It's a lot easier to get more of your kids reading when many of them start on third base from a reading perspective. But if you start with children from less privileged backgrounds, you have a more pure measure of, did the school make these reading outcomes happen? Is the teaching producing readers, or is extracurricular tutoring or sort of parent influence and parent introduction of vocabulary, how much are those things contributing to reading success? So demographically adjusted measures are, in many people's eyes, including my own, one of the best ways of saying, are the schools performing or are the kids benefiting from a number of inputs? And at this point, Mississippi and Louisiana are number 1 and number 2 in reading outcomes for fourth graders when you adjust for demographics. So you've got, states again going from the bottom to much more peak, admirable positions. I'm going to shift gears for a second, tell you the Louisiana story quickly. The Louisiana story was more of a Common Core era story. When the Common Core came along, state leaders in that state, they had a really strong leadership team that said, we're going to take advantage of this change in standards to turn things around. As of 2003, Louisiana was number 50 for reading performance. So they really were started at the bottom states. And Louisiana started with the curriculum-led reform and said, we've got to get curricula that are there to really nurture kids' reading comprehension abilities by developing their background knowledge, giving kids rich and deep vocabularies and schema about the world so that whatever topic they are reading about, they'll be successful understanding as they read into new domains. So they focused first on more comprehensive curricula. And then, so that was sort of their first 5 years of reform. They had teacher teams come in and rate the best curricula, really trained up teachers, also sent coaches into schools, gave out grants for lots of training for teachers, but you had to be using good curriculum and you had to be doing your training aligned to your curriculum. So it was not just, let's train you on the theory, but actually let's really train you on the practice of how to use the tools you're using in your schools. Their outcomes started to rise. And then in the last 5 years, they've added on what we would call these science of reading reforms, requiring teacher training on the reading theory part specifically and the brain science of how kids learn to read, adding on a third grade retention law. The third grade retention law in Louisiana only goes into effect right now. We are currently ending the school year, which will be the first year when they start to retain students. So again, we're starting to see the same policies crop up in a different order and in different timing, but the same short list in all the states. If we then look at the new up-and-comers, Tennessee, about 6 years ago, pursued reforms that looked a lot like Louisiana. Alabama, 5 years ago, practically carbon copied the Mississippi model. And both of those states now are turning up as two of the biggest gainers in the last 5 years. So again, 4 states starts to be a set of data points that I think we really can't ignore, especially when the playbook is ultimately the same, just in slightly different order.
So there's an economist named Roland Fryer, who you might have heard of, who does a lot of work in education. And he's studied charter school systems, looking at which charter school systems do better than others. And 5 qualities that he found that in one study made up about half of a charter school's effectiveness, or the difference in charter schools' effectiveness, were frequent teacher feedback, data-driven instruction, high dosage tutoring, increased instructional time. He and Jeffrey Canada, who runs the Harlem Children's Zone, have said poignantly and kind of humorously that, you're not going to tell the white kids to take Thursday and Friday off. So if you want to catch up, you need more time, right? And then relentless focus on academic achievement, kind of a no excuses model for both teachers and kids. How well do those things map onto what you're seeing in the South?
You can definitely see lots of overlap at the, um, you know, at the tangible level, where the rubber meets the road. So let's think about the sort of no excuses side of things. I'm going to admit that when it comes to fourth grade retention, which is a law in place across all 4 of these states, if you asked me 5 years ago if I thought that was a good policy, I was really on the fence. I was, I thought that would be a really hard choice to push, or to a really hard decision to mandate. We know that it's, personally hard for any child to be told that he or she is, not going to be proceeding. That's and there were many people that put forward data to suggest that actually the 3rd grade retention was just so hard on the child that it, I think that there were some of those, maybe motivated reasoning studies, who knows, but there was a real narrative around 3rd grade retention that just said this is a net negative for kids. But we really can't ignore the fact that across this set of states, they actually aren't retaining a very large percentage of students. That's what's really striking. When I looked at the Alabama data, they were only retaining 1% of students who, in any given year. So if we're going to be really concerned about, we have if we look at the typical state and we look at our national reading proficiency, this idea that really in the NAEP, we have 1/3 of students that aren't reading proficiently in America. And in Alabama, by saying, no, you have to get children to a state-specific proficiency threshold, which is, by the way, not the same as the NAEP threshold. It's a little higher. But you have to get students to this threshold or they're not moving on. It's really clear that everyone pulled out stops and made tutoring happen, made summer learning camps happen. Alabama introduced new summer learning camps that were apparently very well attended and quite successful in producing growth over the summer. Again, this adding of instructional time, touching on another one of your pillars there. But they were, whether it was the tutoring, whether it was the intervention in schools, if they were only retaining 1% of students, that meant that everyone was saying, no excuses. The expectation is we're going to get every kid there. And in the end, they're getting 99 out of 100 there. And then one has to presume in the way that this is now working over time in Mississippi, that 1% that gets retained is a set of students that really does need that additional time for growth. It's the child that needs the more instructional time in the form of additional year. And that no excuses, we're not letting that kid go on to 4th, even if it takes one more year. Again, it all kind of fits together. So I actually think that when I look at the set that you named, that sense of really laser focus of instruction on instruction. Let's maximize instructional time. Let's maximize it within the school day. Let's make sure that we're cutting any fluff, right? In schools, too often we see for reading curriculum that we get what teachers will joke is the Crayola curriculum. Some, cut and glue activities and coloring and so forth in early grades, when frankly, we need kids in books and we need them grappling with words and texts and more practice to make sure that they can decode new words. And we've got to take every drop of instructional time we have to be doing the rich academic work, because we really do have some kids that need every last minute we can get them to be proficient as readers by the end of 3rd. So those are the 2 that I would lean on, but yeah.
So you've talked a lot about reading.
Mm-hmm.
What about math? Is there a similar type of story in the South related to math? And I bring this up as I grew up in Quebec, actually, and Quebec stands out in North America for math,
Mm-hmm.
math curriculum. And I remember noticing, people criticize PISA scores, they're not perfect measures, whatever. But I remember when I went to college in Ontario, noticing that the students from Quebec were much better prepared in math. We can talk later if you want about what the story is there, but I'd love to hear in the United States, is there a similar story about math to the one that you just told about reading of success?
So in the United States, and I'm going to admit I've been focused a whole lot more on reading, but the truth is we don't have quite the same points of light in math that we have in reading. So there's been a little less of a story to focus on. We've also seen some pretty significant declines in math in the last decade. So there's a similar malaise in math. We actually have larger declines in math over the last decade than in reading. We have lower international rankings in math on things like the PISA than we have in reading. So I think we should be knowing that we are, as a nation, not where we want to be in math, without question. And an interesting detail that I've noticed is that each of the Southern Surge states had a major reading initiative. Like, this is a thing we're doing, reading, it's going to be our bag. It had a name. In Tennessee, we had the Reading 360 training, and we had the, Best for All reading initiative. And it didn't mean that there was no focus on math, but reading was very clearly a major pillar of what the state was working on in all four of these states. And yet, in all four states, math outcomes rose, not to the tune of what reading outcomes did, but all four states had a similar effect. Now, why is that? It's frankly not been studied, so I'm just hypothesizing here. But I do hypothesize that the natural effect you get of being a successful reader and being able to go into any other domain, successfully read the text and the questions, you just get the rising tide of reading floating all academic boats. It's easy to forget about how many problems in math are word problems, even by the third or fourth or fifth grade. So I'm thinking that we're getting the tailwinds of the reading effect in math, but the truth is it hasn't been as well studied. The other thing we have to say about math versus reading, and I think this is sometimes not well understood, reading has been a lot more closely studied. I think anyone in the domains would say we just have a deeper body of research in how kids learn to read and reading practices. So the need for systematic phonics to give kids reading foundations so they can break down words, that's been studied up, down, left, right. That is settled science, as they say. Some of the equivalent questions in math are still, I think, it's not in dispute that kids need math foundations and you need to have fluency with math facts. In other words, you need to be able to rattle off your times tables, because if you can't really quickly see that 7 times 6 is 42, then when you really get into the higher order math, if you're sitting there trying to do that one on your fingers or a calculator, not only are you, naturally not going to go as quickly as the rest of the class, but even in what we talk about as your working memory, like if you're needing to use part of your working memory, which can only store a few things at one time, if you've got to be using part of your mental horsepower at any given time to just figure out the basic functions and those math facts down, there's less of your brain that can be freed up to be focusing on the higher order problem that is before you in those later grades. So I don't know anyone that disagrees that we need kids to get to upper grades with those baseline facts in place and a really clear ability to sort of see through numbers in basic ways. But we don't have this deep body of research that can really tell us as much about how to get there and, how much it's going to affect you necessarily, how much it will hold you back, how much dosage do you need of different forms of instruction. The research base is just shallower in math. So when we talk about having reading wars and math wars, the math wars continue to be more philosophical, with different camps and their beliefs pointing to shallower bases of studies. You'll find me to be of the team that believes that we want to give kids all math foundations, and I think we definitely hamstring kids if we don't get that right. But I don't know that our evidence based on exactly the how is as deep.
Yeah, in Quebec, certainly direct instruction and hammering basic facts is a big part of the model. So just making you memorize your times tables, for example, because like you said, you need to have these things be automatic if you're going to then manipulate them in a higher order. There is, I think, a debate in the literature about some of these, like, do you have to, there's some curricula, for example, like we have here, where in Wyoming, where they want you to learn the same math problem a bunch of different ways. So you have a mental model of the, of how numbers work. My understanding is evidence is mixed on that, but like you said, my impression is like yours, that the literature is thinner on math than on reading, but certainly hammering basic facts, direct instruction, rote memorization as necessary was a big part of the Quebec model. I want to come back to the pandemic because a lot of casual observers might listen to this conversation and think, okay, Southern states did better than other states during the pandemic. Well, you don't need a PhD in education to understand that they didn't close their schools for as long, right? So how important is pandemic policy to understanding the Southern surge?
It's a really good question, and the short answer I would say is, we don't have sophisticated answers on these things because America, honestly, we weren't even collecting data in a particularly granular fashion about who was closed and who wasn't. Um, I think people miss how much our federal government decided that that was not going to be their bag. And it was actually a Brown economist named Emily Oster who raised some money to go create a database of what were case rates like and who was open and closed because the federal government opted out. And an organization called Burbio, which had a calendar app, like stepped in to start to track these things too. So we had these really funny private responses when, across the globe in Europe, every state government had their, school tracker and they were taking this on as their own responsibility. So we don't have the data that I would like us to have on this. Certainly any analyses that have been run that look at these things at higher order levels, where you're looking at a state by state level, do show that states that had more protracted closures did suffer more learning loss and had greater drops. But then we look at a state like Tennessee, where the large urban districts actually did stay closed for a fairly long period of time, even as rural districts were more likely to be open. So again, it's hard to talk in categoricals. Where I go to, what's really important here is, there's no state, back to my Tennessee example, there's no state that didn't have some degree of suffering from pandemic school closures. But these stories in Tennessee, Louisiana, Louisiana and Mississippi in particular, these are decade plus old stories.
Right.
And that's almost the most important thing to say here, because I think sometimes people look for silver bullets in education. You're not just going to, for example, go back to basics and get some phonics in, and 2 or 3 years later, see statewide reading outcomes go up. You've got to invest in these multi-layered efforts to make change. To me, what makes these models so clearly ones to follow is that they've stood the test of time. If you look at Mississippi's outcomes, they've just marched lockstep up and up and up. Louisiana has they're new, right behind Mississippi, now lockstep gains. Louisiana made the greatest gains in reading outcomes since the pandemic of any state. So they're starting to get on their hockey stick toward the end of this last decade. And then you have 2 states that pursue the very similar rinse and repeat reforms, maybe even a little more efficiently because they could copy the model rather than have to figure it out themselves. And inside of 5 or 6 years, they're seeing similar gains. And if we line those states up next to other states, like, let's say, Arkansas, who didn't have protracted closures, but didn't make the reforms we're talking about, we're not just seeing that, hey, reading outcomes are rising wherever closures were shorter. We're seeing reading outcomes are rising where they are investing in teachers, investing in better curriculum, mandating that the teaching be aligned to practices we know to work, sending in coaches when schools are not performing very well. It's the reform, stupid. It is not any quirk of pandemic closures or any other data.
So back to this idea of relentless focus on academic achievement. You talked about how the reforms are more clearly the signal than whether you close your schools or not. What about absenteeism, right? That's the outcome that you could see being most obviously tied to the pandemic. And I wonder, are you seeing any spillover effects on absenteeism from these reforms, maybe via their focus on academic achievement, kind of like how you said you're seeing some spillovers from reading to math?
Yeah, I love this question. I haven't seen this studied very closely, and it's not a detail that I've gone to look into to see is absenteeism, which, and again, typically when I see absenteeism, it's measured at pretty like state levels. It's either measured at district levels or state levels. It's harder to drill down and say elementary absenteeism versus high school absenteeism. I don't see a lot of good data, or I haven't invested the time to chase down good data that looks in that level of granularity. So it's harder to say things like, these states have less absenteeism because kids are reading better. I'm not sure that the data is, we may have data out there that says that, I just don't know of it. One thing that I would point people to, and this one feels really important because in an era where, student behavior is a concern in a lot of regions, we do have pretty clear evidence that when schools start to see, they make these investments in better reading outcomes, we see consistent reporting from schools that actually referrals to principals and discipline issues go down. Because when kids are successful at the academic part, they're less likely to be goofing around, acting out. We hear all kinds of stories from parents of kids with dyslexia or other struggles talking about how their child was the kid who tried to get themselves kicked out of class before the reading circle because that's when they were going to be outed as a kid who couldn't read. So I think that the evidence that we can drive down some of the behavioral and discipline issues with really tight academic classrooms where kids are succeeding and thriving, and they want to be there because they can get through that next lesson or activity with success. I think that's the virtuous cycle we want to create in all schools.
Yeah, kids rise to meet our expectations or fall to meet our expectations. One other follow-up that I think is striking about the Southern Surge is that many of these states are poor. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the national dialogue about education is, are we spending enough money? So did these reforms in Mississippi and other states that you've been following, were they expensive? Did they have significant fiscal implications for those states? Or were they just examples of better use of existing resources?
It's a really good question. In simplest terms, they are a great example of better use of existing resources. So none of the states that we're talking about needed, dramatically different special infusions of dollars. If I look at Tennessee, Tennessee did use some of their federal stimulus funding from the, post-pandemic era, but every other state got that funding too. So to me, this is the classic example of cost neutral reform where you just take some of the dollars that you're given and you better channel them toward proven initiatives. That's the simplest answer, but I would never want to leave anyone to believe that money is nothing. If there hadn't been those stimulus dollars, would Tennessee have been able to make its investments? Well, not necessarily. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that money is nothing in education. But I do think it's really important to put pressure at this moment on some of these questions about of whether funding is the panacea that I often hear it made to be in education. You hear so many people talk about, well, like, of course our schools are underperforming, our underfunded schools. And I don't applaud the per pupil spending in Mississippi and Louisiana. I personally think it ought to be higher, but it is what it is. It's in the bottom 10 in the country. In those two states, pulled their kids from the bottom to, they will soon, if they stay on the same trajectory, be at the top of the country in their reading outcomes in the next handful of years without adjusting for demographics, because they're getting their kids at the bottom and at the top. Everyone's rising. So what excuse do we have in my state, New York, where we spend more than any other state? What excuse do we have to not put every administrator on a plane to figure out how they can copy those reforms?
Yeah, you've hit on exactly what I was going to ask you next, which is the obvious burning question at the end of this conversation. Why isn't everybody doing this? And moreover, why are we especially not seeing places who claim education is one of their top priorities to do this? I keep thinking about Chicago, which has some of the worst schools in the country and whose mayor is a career educator. Why is he not getting on a plane to Mississippi to figure out what's going on? Obviously, you're not him, but do you have a sense for why this is? Why are we not all doing this?
So it's an excellent question, and it's the hardest question to answer because it's so irrational that easy answers elude us. Every state should be doing this. I think some of the barriers include many state leaders don't really see it as their job to tell schools how to teach. Many state departments of education really see their mission as go get more funding for my districts, go get more supports for my districts, do some lightweight oversight of what's happening in schools. But there isn't a culture in a lot of states of expecting that the Department of Education has a real role in deciding how schools teach. In part, that's because local control norms have a history of being really strong in education. And when we get to more progressive states, there's a strong culture of trust the teachers, empower the teachers know best. To the degree that in many states, we actually see a reluctance to even have districts mandate curriculum used by teachers. We have a legacy in America of giving the teacher a lot of responsibility, which frankly is a lot of pressure on teachers to not only go into the classroom and deliver the lessons and instruction, but also to figure out what should have been in the lessons in the first place. If you're me, I don't think it's fair to ask someone who, curriculum development is a specialty. It's people spend decades becoming really good curriculum developers. And that's not just because it's important to put together one good lesson, but because curriculum should be something that is cohesive from grade K to grade 12. And so if I've got an elementary school and I want to know that kids are building strong academic vocabulary across a lot of domains between kindergarten and fifth grade. And when we talk about academic vocabulary, we talk about words that are in frequent use that kids wouldn't hear every day, but they're going to encounter frequently when they're reading. So we've got these words that are described as, tier 2 vocabulary words because they're sophisticated but high use. And how do I know that I'm exposing my students to the best diet of tier 2 words across those 5 years? How do I know that they're getting the right dosage and the right balance of words that touch on history domains versus science domains versus arts domains if I don't have a common curriculum so I know what's taught in different years? In schools where the teacher is left to make the decision, we often see like, oh, look, it's February. And so everybody's doing a Rosa Parks unit. And I get to study Rosa Parks in 3 of my different grades, as opposed to giving students, again, a sort of broader set of topics that they're studying across those same grades. So really, we're swirling around here some of these cultural issues that it can be hard if a culture in the Department of Education is to leave it to schools and trust the schools. It can be hard if the culture in a district is leave it to teachers and trust the teachers, to then go and say, no, actually, we need a lot more central planning to be effective. But that's ultimately what the answer is. And if you look at the texture of the work across all of these southern surge states, that's ultimately what they got to. But
okay, is the local control story? I mean, I definitely buy it to a point, but I wonder if it's letting some of these states off too easy. Because, for example, California has at various times tried to force all their schools to teach ethnic studies. Various states have tried to force their schools to stop tracking students, right, by ability in subjects like math. So it seems like when they really want to, they can find the bone for state level control. So why are they not finding it here when they have a proven opportunity to help their most disadvantaged students, which always seems like in the news is supposed to be a priority of the left? Why aren't they doing this?
You ask such a good question. And if you want my real answer,
Yeah, let's hear it.
I think it's because these details are nuanced. And people have a tendency to trust their schools. When we look at national surveys, we see this really interesting dichotomy where even when Americans, and Americans do increasingly say we have lower and lower trust of education in America. We believe surveys would suggest, National Pew surveys, et cetera, that we trust our schools less. But every time you turn around and drill into the survey data, what you see is Americans trust education, the monolith, less, but they trust their local schools the same amount. So we get, and why is that? I think a lot of it's the selection effect, because an awful lot of families move to a region for the schools. So if I moved to this town and I chose to pay into this, high tax region to have good schools, well, I'm going to trust these people and these teachers and the teacher I look in the eye each day. So we have a tendency to believe that schools must be teaching well. And I think we're seeing the best evidence of that. We've seen a lot of journalism in the last few years. For example, Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast that has done a really nice job of explaining to the average parent or layman that a lot of schools were actually teaching reading the wrong way. And she explains it so elegantly that you come away really, really grasping the facts that had happened, and also to some degree how silly it was. I mean, when you look at the beliefs that educators had about how reading was to be taught, it almost blows your mind that we had schools so far afield of what they needed to be doing for a lot of years. And parents are shocked to hear this. I regularly meet parents who are like, can you explain this to me? How did this happen? Because we have this trust that schools are getting it right. So it's not a native instinct on the part of any parent or voter to walk into the day, a school, the policy arena, and think, we need to go reform those schools and how they're teaching. So in many ways, I think that these problems persist because people don't have a sophisticated enough understanding to demand better. One reason that I'm talking so much about the Southern Surge is I want there to be this visible model of better to help contrast for states like mine that know you can't rest on your laurels and know the problem isn't whatever you're excusing away as the reason that's not your teaching. In fact, you could be teaching better. You should be teaching better. There's an exemplar for it. And let's make that evident. But that's what I really believe. I believe they're not going after those changes because there's been a culture of believing that how reading was taught, that like teachers were making the best decisions in their classroom about how to teach. And that wasn't really a lever we could pull. We have to disabuse people of that idea.
So a couple of follow-ups to that. One, your point that people have more trust of their local schools than the national schools is actually an example of a really broad pattern. So there's surveys that ask people, how much is X a problem in your country, crime, immigration, whatever it is, and how much of it is a problem in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
If people were unbiased, those on average should be the same, right? Some neighborhoods are worse than others, but the average score should be the same. Of course, what you see is people are very optimistic about their neighborhood on average and very pessimistic about their country. And I've seen this, not just in the US, there's also a famous survey that did this in Britain. And so I think news negativity is, and also just salience bias of negativity, right? You never see a story that's like, X country didn't go to war today, right?
Yeah.
You only hear about things that go wrong. Okay, the other thing I wanted to follow up on. So a few minutes ago, we were talking about how the progressive Democrat states were, deferring to local control in some areas where you would think their objectives would contradict that. I think you could ask the same question about Mississippi and Louisiana, right? It's a traditionally conservative Republican value to respect local control. And yet in this instance, they didn't to positive effect. What do you think explains that politically?
It's funny. I was asking, fairly um, a fairly savvy Louisianan that question recently because I don't profess to necessarily understand um, how some states have been able to pull this off when others didn't. Beyond, I'm going to say that one obvious factor is leadership. Um, we definitely saw exceptionally strong leaders in all four of the states that we're talking about, particularly Kerry Wright in Mississippi, John White in Louisiana. We just had strong leaders that believed change was possible.
And what were their jobs, just for those who don't know the politics of those states?
Yeah, they were basically the state commissioner of education equivalent during
Gotcha.
the beginning of these reform eras. So strong leadership was definitely a factor because we didn't have, back to our exemplars, it's not like every southern state or every state that didn't close its schools, et cetera, saw a rise. It was specific states that pursued specific reforms, none of which were easy to get passed, right? It wasn't easy in these local control states, to make these changes happen. The answer is a couple fold. I did have, one Louisianan official say to me, well, we, even though we have a legacy of local control, we also have a legacy of understanding that at times in our nation's history, for example, around, civil rights issues and so forth, like there were times when our states were getting it wrong. And actually it was the long arm of the state coming in and saying we had to make some changes that did ultimately improve outcomes for our residents. So there's maybe a little bit more comfort than you believe in sometimes the state has to come in and stomp its feet and make change happen here in the South than you have in the North. I thought that was an interesting speculation. But let's talk about Louisiana for a second, because like you say, some of these local control norms, when Louisiana set out to do curriculum-based reform, they didn't mandate that schools had to use certain curricula, but they did what they describe as make the best choice the easy choice. So they put out such loud and clear reviews of curriculum that it was painfully easy for anyone to see if a district kept choosing to use something crummy. They also, in all of their grant programs, tied their grants. You want this state grant to get professional learning for your teachers? Great. You have to be doing professional learning for one of the good curricula. So suddenly schools have a financial incentive to use the good curricula. So effectively, they just use their policy levers in super smart ways, which is, again, part of why it defies logic that this isn't happening everywhere, because every state could be pursuing these reforms. I must take a moment to shout out Massachusetts. In the last 5 years, Massachusetts has put together some really creative reforms to incentivize better use of curricula in a fashion that's not dissimilar to Louisiana's. They've had grant programs that, frankly, that even for a phase, they were saying, we know what the bad curricula are. You have a leg up in applying for this grant if you're trying to replace one of these weak things. So finally, we were seeing states like Massachusetts step up saying, we know what good looks like. We know what bad looks like. It's time for the districts that are using bad to know we're going to incentivize change and try to push folks to a much better place. So we can't get out there and mandate, but we can use the power of the purse to strongly encourage. These reforms should be possible in every state, but it's very fair for all of us to keep asking why they aren't.
What do you think is the role of schools of education in either being part of the problem here or part of the solution? And I say this because, I know there are exceptions for some charter schools and various things, but schools of education are the main training ground for teachers. They're supposed to be the main engine of research on these things. And there's a national impression that schools of education are particularly extreme in the ways that a lot of Americans have come to realize that academics are extreme. And I have to say, I can't speak to the School of Education here at my current university, which I've just been at for a year, But I have to say that in most other universities I've been at, the reality is actually quite a bit worse than the public stereotype, right? So, for example, one of the most cited textbooks in education schools is Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which literally praises Stalin and Mao, right? Or sorry, Lenin and Mao. Imagine the right-wing equivalent of that, right? Imagine if it came out that our most cited education textbooks were written by literal Nazi sympathizers whose most famous ideas were directly related to their Nazi sympathizing. Like, there's no way that the Biden administration and the Obama administration wouldn't come down on that like a ton of bricks. And if you replace Nazism with communism, and people can argue about whether that's an appropriate comparison, but by death toll, communism was actually significantly worse. That's basically the situation in a lot of schools of education right now. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on, what role do you see schools of ed playing in what's going on, kind of either for better or for worse?
Schools of education loom large when people talk about this problem because teaching is a field where there's a reasonable amount of turnover. Every year, somewhere between 7 and 12% of teachers are new to the profession. So you've got this constant influx of people that are coming out of an environment, and what are the influences that they're given before they walk in that building to start teaching in year one. When we've seen analyses done in the United States of schools of education, we know that the learning sciences, how do kids learn to read? How does reading happen in the brain? What's the cognitive science understanding of how the brain learns and stores new memories and so forth? You'd think that schools of education would be teaching that to teachers, and we know that that is practically missing from teacher preparation programs across the country. Even the tangible, let me tell you enough about how kids learn to read that you understand the role of phonics and foundational skills to kids' ability to acquire, to sort of understand how the English language breaks down and read new words when they come across them. Even those phonics basics, when an organization named NCTQ, the National Center for Teaching Quality, which has been doing a report on this, as of about 5 years ago, when they were doing reports, we were seeing something like a quarter of schools even covering that information in their syllabus. So while a read of a syllabus isn't a perfect read for what happens in classrooms, it's pretty directionally accurate. And so we knew we had this major problem. A few years later, into the science of reading conversation, NCTQ reported that now we were up to, good news, now we were up to half of schools actually covering this information in their syllabus. And we had to sit there saying, well, great that we've seen a really marked rise over a few years, but we're still only at half. So the fact that teaching colleges give short shrift to these really core essentials about learning, and that instead students are spending their time on, and of course, we're talking about colleges across the country, so there isn't one what teachers are learning instead template, but yeah, that you hear teachers talking about how they were instructed on how to construct their own philosophy of a learner and how to, construct their own sense of how to write a great lesson, as opposed to how do I get out there and know if a lesson I've been given is teaching kids enough basics about reading or math for them to be successful. Definitely teaching colleges, big part of the problem. I worry sometimes, and also I think people like to talk about teaching colleges as a core part of the problem because it allows us to let school districts off the hook. If you blame the people who prepared the teachers, well then, they're an easy scapegoat. We should be going overboard and bending over backwards to demand better from schools of education. I'd like to see both states and districts using their purchasing power more effectively to say, you know what, if you're not training kids in phonics, I'm not hiring from your university. I'd love to see much more of that direct pressure. And we're seeing more states step up to take direct pressure and action around these issues. But at the end of the day, I think the equal question should be asked more often, which is, if everyone knows that teaching colleges aren't teaching these basics, why do we have teachers getting a decade into their career and still saying, I still don't have this information? This
Right. School districts should be stepping up, as
school
you're saying.
districts should be stepping up and saying, all right, if people didn't get it in their prep, it's got to be a core part of their PD. And or I've really got to take responsibility for giving teachers a curriculum that does align to these key practices, because if you can't learn it in your prep, you will at least be learning it on the job while learning by doing. And we've got to have professional learning for teachers around these issues. It's no accident that the biggest reform we're seeing, one of the loudest reforms across the southern surge states and one of the most consistent reforms across the country, is this science of reading training, where we're seeing training institutes or subsidized training being offered to teachers nationwide to effectively let teachers catch up on what they missed in teacher preparation. There's an entire Facebook group called The Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, which is teachers coaching each other on this information. And it's the biggest teacher Facebook group I know of.
So one more top-down government question.
Mm-hmm.
We currently have a federal government and governments in many states that are acutely aware of some of the problems in academia. And yet they're in many cases doing things like defunding medical research and leaving the schools of ed alone. Why? Do you know?
This is just such a depressing moment in American culture because, and I say this with, at this point, I would self-identify as an independent voter because depressing things are happening on both sides of the aisle as far as I'm concerned. I don't know why culture warish issues and some of these insubstantive issues gain the currency that they do. It's a little bit mind-boggling. The one I like to talk about is the degree to which in the last 5 years, the country has been really catalyzed by these questions of what's in the school library, what content is in classrooms, and whether a text like genderqueer should be in a middle school library and kids should have access to that book at a school or should not have access to that book in a school. That is a question on which reasonable adults can disagree. Reasonable adults on both sides of the political spectrum have really strong opinions. That question has been animating the media. We had animated questions about book bans. Book ban laws started, parental right laws to go and push objectionable books out of libraries swept some states, and laws to protect access to library books swept other states. And everyone was giving so much energy and attention to what was ultimately a tiny fraction of the share of books in the library. And meanwhile, this wave of momentum around actual success reading the books, like I think the thing that should animate all of us is, can 95% of our middle schoolers read the average book in the library successfully and fluently? Like that should be your animating issue. That is our declining NAEP outcomes should be on every front page, and the Southern surge, the ability of some states to push back on those trends, that should be everywhere. But for whatever reason that I can't possibly say I have all the answers to why, some of these cultural issues that end up being swashbuckling leaders who are going to take a stance and save us from the good guys who are X or the bad guys who are Y, trading in low substance issues that get people riled up is electoral currency in America in 2025. So.
Yeah, I as a moderate Canadian who doesn't vote in the U.S. yet, I hopefully will naturalize in a couple of years. I resonate a lot with your independent mindset and frustration with some of the political discourse. Okay, my last question is the following. I have a child on the autism spectrum, and so I think a lot about how do the education system serve children with developmental challenges. And I sometimes wonder if the defeatism in the political narrative on both sides about learning outcomes is the other side, is kind of the negative side of the coin of the relentless focus on academic achievement. In some of the early years of my son's education, I felt like he sometimes had teachers who thought that success for him was getting through the day without some kind of calamity. And it didn't matter if he learned anything. I remember a parent-teacher conference where they were saying how he wasn't doing very well. And I asked, what fraction of his work has he completed? And they said, maybe 15 to 20%. And I said, okay, I don't want to talk about anything else.
Yeah.
That's obviously the problem.
Yeah.
And so my question is, do you think that some of the reason that there's less urgency than maybe you and I would like around spreading these reforms is that too many people have accepted the status quo as inevitable? That, well, our schools are just bad. Our kids are just struggling. You know what I mean? Is complacent? How big of a part of the problem is complacency and accepting failure?
There's definitely complacency out there, but I don't know that a lot of it's malicious complacency, right?
Oh no, I didn't mean to suggest that. More just kind of resigned complacency.
I do think it's resigned complacency, and we have to look at how we create narratives to explain what's in front of us when we don't have other explanations. If I'm in a school district and I'm an educator and I'm working my butt off, right? Like, nobody is saying that we have reading failure in America because we have teachers who don't care or don't try hard. That's
right.
Not a thing. So
right.
Instead, we have teachers that are going in and teaching in a way that spins wheels. They haven't been given the right training, the right preparation to know how to do better. So if you're in there and you're spinning your wheels and you're working your tail off, but a third of your kids are just not getting there on reading, it's not human nature to say, well, that's because systemically we're not teaching reading right. It's human nature to find other narratives, like some kids aren't read to at home. Some kids have all these other struggles that they're up against. I think that's even some of where you get we need to raise, we need to improve social outcomes for families because we all know that poor kids can't learn. We all know that. And it's not true, but it's the story we tell ourselves that feeds our complacency, that allows us each day to feel like I did the best I could in a situation where I can't control what happens to the some kids who can't get there. And again, it's why I'm grateful for you having me on, because you can't see that there are places doing better, and you could be those places. You could overcome that complacency. You could get your poor readers to the top number 1 and 2 slot in the nation when they used to be at the bottom if you just did the following things for your teachers in your schools. You can't see that if no one's talking about it. So again, I think the most important thing we can be doing is elevating these examples of doing better, elevate these examples of change potential, because it debunks those narratives that we've been telling ourselves about our schools and what they can or can't do.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. I think this is such an important story for people to learn. I hope that you will all subscribe to Karen's Substack called School Yourself and check out the Curriculum Insight Project. And if you're a parent or a voter or an advocate, know that better outcomes exist and demand better models, which also exist. Don't resign yourself to complacency about the state of what's going on in our schools and our learners. It's maybe the most important thing for the future of our country, to have a good education system. So Karen Vaites, thank you so much for coming on Grounded Not Divided, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Grounded Not Divided. If you want to hear more episodes like this, be Be sure to subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or on the Guided Civic Revival Substack. You can also email us feedback at matt.burgess@uwyo.edu. See you next time.